The dust-laden wind swept across the auction platform where Grace Kennedy stood, her thin fingers clutching her 5-year-old son's fevered hand as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the town square of San Angelo, Texas, in the summer of 1878. Next up, the widow Kennedy and her boy, 2 for the price of 1, though the child sickly, as you can plainly see. Grace flinched at the callous words, her eyes downcast as curious onlookers and potential buyers studied her worn calico dress and the hollow cheeks of her son, Thomas. The boy's small frame shuddered with each labored breath, his skin burning with fever despite the scorching Texas heat. 3 months ago, she'd had a home, a loving husband, and hope. Now, with Henry dead from a bullet meant for someone else during a saloon brawl and their farm seized for debts, she was property to be sold alongside her ailing child. Starting bid at $50 for the woman young enough to work, cook, and keep house. Boy comes with her, though he might not last the summer. The auctioneer called, his voice dripping with indifference to their plight. Grace bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, refusing to let tears fall as she heard murmurs from the crowd. Ain't paying good money for a woman with a dying child. Too much trouble. Pretty enough, but that boy's a burden. The auctioneer frowned at the lack of response. Come now, folks, $40, $35. From the back of the crowd, a tall figure moved forward. Sunlight glinted off spurs as a man in a dust-covered duster cut through the onlookers. His dark Stetson shadowed blue eyes that studied Grace and her son with an intensity that made her grip Thomas's hand tighter. $300, he stated, his voice quiet but carrying across the suddenly silent square. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. Did I hear that right, Mr. Quinn? $300 for the widow and her sickly boy. Quentin Quinn nodded once, reaching into his vest to pull out the money. You heard correct. Whispers erupted among the townsfolk as the auctioneer's gavel came down with finality. Sold to Mr. Quinn. Grace felt the world sway beneath her feet. $300 was far more than she was worth in this market, especially with a sick child. What kind of man paid such a sum? And for what purpose? Her heart hammered in her chest as the tall cowboy approached. Madam, he said with a slight nod, extending a hand to help her down from the platform. Name's Quentin Quinn. I own the Double Q Ranch about 10 miles north of town. Grace hesitated before taking his offered hand. Mr. Quinn, she managed, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas swayed on his feet, his small face flushed with fever. Before Grace could react, Quentin knelt before the boy. Hey there, little man, he said gently. Looks like you could use a doctor and a proper bed. Without waiting for permission, he scooped Thomas into his arms, the boy's head lolling against his shoulder. My son needs medicine, Grace said, finding her voice at last. Whatever work you require of me, I'll do it, but please, first things first, Quentin interrupted, already striding toward a wagon at the edge of the square. We're going to see Doc Miller. Your boy needs attention more than my ranch needs another pair of hands. Grace hurried to keep pace with his long strides, confusion warring with desperate hope. Why? She blurted out before she could stop herself. Why would you pay so much for us when anyone could see my son is ill? Quentin paused beside his wagon, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. Something in his gaze, a shadow of old pain, made her breath catch. Because no mother and child should be sold like cattle, he answered simply. And because I've seen what happens when good doctors aren't found in time. He settled Thomas in the wagon bed, where he'd arranged blankets into a makeshift bed. Climb up, Mrs. Kennedy. Doc Miller's the best physician in 3 counties, and he owes me a favor. As the wagon pulled away from the auction square, Grace cast one look back at the platform where her dignity had been stripped away. She didn't know what awaited her at the Double Q Ranch, but for the first time in months, she felt something dangerous flicker in her heart. Hope. Doc Miller's office sat at the edge of San Angelo, a whitewashed building with green shutters that had seen better days. Quentin pulled the wagon to a halt and was around to Grace's side before she could climb down herself. "Madam," he said, offering his hand. Grace took it reluctantly, still uncertain about this strange cowboy who'd purchased her and her son at auction. His hand was calloused but gentle, and he released her the moment her feet touched the ground. Thomas moaned softly from the wagon bed, his small face contorted with discomfort. Quentin lifted him carefully, cradling the boy against his chest as if he weighed nothing at all. "Doc," he called as he pushed through the door, Grace following anxiously behind. "Need you now." A thin man with spectacles and a shock of white hair emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. His eyes widened at the sight of Thomas. "Quinn, what have you brought me?" he asked, already gesturing toward an examination table. "Boy's running a high fever. Been sick for how long, Mrs. Kennedy?" Quentin turned to Grace. "Almost 2 weeks," she admitted, twisting her hands in her worn skirt. "I tried willow bark tea and cool compresses, but he's getting worse. After my husband died, we couldn't afford the doctor." Doc Miller was already examining Thomas, his hands expertly feeling the boy's glands, checking his eyes and ears. "Breathing's labored, glands are swollen. Looks like pneumonia to me, and a bad case at that." He glanced at Grace. "He needs medicines I don't keep in large supply and round-the-clock care." Grace's heart sank. "I don't have any money, but I can work. The bill's mine," Quentin interrupted. "Whatever he needs, Doc." Miller raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll need to prepare a tincture of horehound and some other medicines. He'll need to stay here tonight where I can monitor him." "I'm staying with him," Grace said firmly, finding strength in her maternal resolve. Quentin nodded. "Of course. I'll see to it you have whatever you need." He turned to the doctor. "Is there anything you need from the general store or the apothecary?" As the two men discussed medicines and treatments, Grace sat beside her son, stroking his fevered brow. Thomas's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glazed. "Mama," he whispered. "I'm here, sweetheart," she soothed, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "The doctor's going to make you better." "Are we going to heaven like Papa?" he asked, his voice so faint it nearly broke her. Grace choked back a sob. "No, darling, we're staying right here. You're going to get well." Thomas's eyes drifted closed again, and Grace looked up to find Quentin watching them, an unreadable expression on his face. "I'll fetch what the doc needs," he said quietly, "and bring back some food for you both." "Why are you doing this?" Grace asked, unable to contain the question any longer. "You've already spent far too much, Mrs. Kennedy," Quentin interrupted gently. "There are some debts in this world that can never be repaid. Let's just say I'm trying to balance the scales a bit." Before she could question him further, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Doc Miller worked efficiently, mixing medicines and preparing a steam treatment to ease Thomas's breathing. "Your boy's a fighter," he commented as he listened to the child's chest with a stethoscope. "Strong heart. Good lungs, despite the infection." "He's all I have left," Grace whispered. The doctor gave her a considering look. "Quinn's a good man, you know. Best rancher in these parts and fair to everyone who works for him. You could have ended up with far worse at that auction." Grace stiffened. "I'm aware of my good fortune, Doctor." Miller's expression softened. "That's not what I meant. Quinn doesn't keep servants or... Well, he's not the type to purchase people is what I'm saying. It's not his way." "Then why, that's his story to tell," Miller said, cutting her off gently. "But I will say this, that man has seen his share of suffering, more than most." Before Grace could press for more information, Quentin returned, his arms laden with packages. He set them down on a side table and began unpacking. Medicines from the apothecary, food from the hotel restaurant, a small bundle of clean clothing that looked to be child-sized, and a neatly folded nightgown that brought a flush to Grace's cheeks. "Wasn't sure of the boy's size," he said, nodding toward the children's clothes. "And the lady at the mercantile helped with." He gestured vaguely toward the nightgown, a slight redness creeping up his neck. "Thank you," Grace said, genuinely moved by his thoughtfulness. "For everything." Quentin shifted uncomfortably. "Doc, I've taken a room at the hotel for Mrs. Kennedy. Figure she'll want to be close by, but she should have somewhere to rest properly." "I'm not leaving Thomas," Grace stated firmly. "I expected as much," Quentin replied with the hint of a smile. "But the offer stands when you need it." Doc Miller cleared his throat. "The boy needs the medicine every 4 hours through the night. I'll stay with him till midnight, then you can take over, Mrs. Kennedy." "Quinn, you planning to head back to the ranch?" Quentin shook his head. "I'll be at the hotel if you need anything." He turned to Grace. "Mrs. Kennedy, when your boy is well enough to travel, I've got a room prepared at the ranch house for you both. My housekeeper, Mrs. Oakes, is getting it ready." "Mr. Quinn," Grace began, gathering her courage. "I appreciate your kindness, but I need to understand what will be expected of me at your ranch. I can cook and clean, and I'm not afraid of hard work, but Mrs. Kennedy," Quentin said, his voice gentle but firm, "all I expect is for you to help your boy get well. After that, we can discuss if you want to stay on at the Double Q. As for your position—" He paused, considering his words carefully. "My ranch needs a school teacher. The hands have children, and there's no school for 20 miles. If you're willing, that would be a fair exchange for room and board for you and your son." Grace stared at him in surprise. "A school teacher? But I never said I could teach." "You read to your boy at the auction," Quentin observed. "Shakespeare, wasn't it?" Not many in these parts quote "all the world's a stage to comfort a sick child." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the realization he'd been watching them before the auction began. "I taught briefly before I married," she admitted. "But that was years ago." "Then it's settled," Quentin said, as if the matter were decided. "Rest now. I'll check in tomorrow morning." With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Grace to wonder about the enigmatic cowboy who had just altered the course of her life. The night passed in a blur of worry and hope. Thomas's fever broke shortly before dawn, his skin cooling under Grace's trembling fingers. Doc Miller returned early, looking pleased at the boy's improvement. "He's responding well to the medicine," he confirmed. "Another day or two of rest, and he should be strong enough to make the journey to the ranch." "Then he'll recover completely?" Grace asked, hardly daring to hope. "Children are remarkably resilient," Miller said. "With continued care and proper nutrition, I expect a full recovery." Grace closed her eyes, relief washing over her like a wave. When she opened them, Quentin was standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light. He'd shaved and changed his clothes, but the weariness around his eyes suggested he'd slept little. "Good news?" he asked quietly. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Quentin's smile transformed his face, softening the hard angles and lighting his blue eyes. "That calls for a proper breakfast," he declared. "Doc, can the boy manage some broth?" "Broth would be excellent," Miller agreed. "And perhaps some soft bread for Mrs. Kennedy. I doubt she's eaten properly in days." Grace wanted to protest that she wasn't hungry, but her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl that made Thomas giggle weakly from his sick. The sound of her son's laughter, however faint, was like music. "Mama's tummy is angry," Thomas whispered. "Then we'd best feed it before it gets any angrier," Quentin said solemnly to the boy, winking at Grace. "I know just the place." He disappeared again. returning half an hour later with a basket from the hotel restaurant. The smell of fresh bread and chicken broth filled the small doctor's office, making Grace's mouth water embarrassingly. While she ate ravenously, Quentin sat beside Thomas's bed, helping the boy manage small spoonfuls of broth. His large hands were surprisingly gentle, his patience seemingly endless as Thomas took each small sip. "You're good with children," Grace observed when Thomas had fallen back into a peaceful sleep. Quentin's expression flickered briefly before settling into something unreadable. "Had some practice," was all he said. Grace wanted to ask more but sensed his reluctance. Instead, she changed the subject. "Tell me about this school you want me to teach." Quentin seemed relieved at the shift. "It's nothing formal yet. Got about 15 children ranging from 5 to 13. Their parents work the ranch, cowboys, cooks, blacksmith, and such. Been trying to convince the county to send a teacher for 2 years, but we're too far out for most city folks' liking. 15 children of different ages. That's quite an undertaking," Grace mused. "I'd need books, slates. Whatever you need, just make a list," Quentin said. "Been setting aside money for this purpose." Grace studied him curiously. "Most ranch owners wouldn't bother educating their workers' children." Quentin's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm not most ranch owners." After a pause, he added, "Education is a way out of poverty, a way to choose your own path." There was something in his voice, a conviction that suggested personal experience. Grace wondered about his story but held her questions. She was still, technically, his property, a thought that twisted uncomfortably in her stomach, despite his kindness. 2 days, Doc Miller announced, returning from seeing another patient. 2 days of rest and the boy can travel to the ranch, provided the journey is taken slowly and he stays warm. Quentin nodded. "I'll bring the covered wagon, we'll make him comfortable. And Mrs. Kennedy will need proper attire," Miller added pointedly. "Can't have her catching pneumonia next." Grace looked down at her threadbare dress self-consciously. It was the only one she had left after selling everything else to try to pay her husband's debts and buy medicine for Thomas. "I've already spoken to Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile," Quentin said. "She's expecting you when you're ready. The account's open." Grace's pride bristled. "Mr. Quinn, your generosity is overwhelming, but I can't accept. Consider it an advance on your teaching salary," he interrupted. "Can't have the double QTS schoolteacher looking anything less than respectable." Before she could argue further, Thomas stirred, his small voice calling for water. The discussion was postponed as they both turned their attention to the boy. 2 days later, as promised, Quentin arrived with a wagon specially outfitted with a mattress, pillows, and blankets in the bed. Thomas, though still weak, was alert and curious about the tall cowboy who had purchased them at the auction. "Are you going to be my new papa?" he asked innocently as Quentin lifted him into the wagon. Grace froze, mortified, but Quentin didn't miss a beat. "No, partner," he said gently. "I'm just a friend who's going to give you and your mama a place to stay while you get strong again." Thomas considered this, his small brow furrowed. "But you bought us. Mama said a man named Mr. Banks bought our house and made us leave. Then you bought us at the auction." Quentin's jaw tightened at the boy's simple understanding of their situation. He knelt beside the wagon to be at eye level with Thomas. "That's not how it works with people, son," he said carefully. "No one can really own another person. That auction." He glanced at Grace, who was watching the exchange with tear-bright eyes. "That auction was wrong. I just helped you and your mama out of a bad situation. The only thing you owe me is to get well. You understand?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir." Grace turned away, not wanting her son to see her tears. She'd been to the Mercantile the previous day, outfitting herself and Thomas with sturdy, practical clothing suitable for ranch life. The simple dignity of wearing a properly fitted dress, and knowing her son had clean clothes that weren't falling apart had nearly undone her in the fitting room. Mrs. Henderson had been kindness itself, showing no judgment for Grace's circumstances. "Mr. Quinn is a good man," she'd said while wrapping Grace's purchases. "Lost his wife and daughter to scarlet fever 5 years back. Hasn't been the same since." The revelation had explained much about Quentin's determination to save Thomas, though Grace had kept this knowledge to herself. If he wanted her to know his story, he would tell her himself. The journey to the Double Q took nearly 3 hours at the careful pace Quentin set, mindful of Thomas's condition. The boy slept for much of it, nestled among the blankets with Grace beside him. From her seat, she watched the landscape change, the town of San Angelo giving way to rolling grasslands dotted with mesquite and live oak. "It's beautiful," she remarked, breaking a comfortable silence. Quentin nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Best rangeland in Texas. My father started with 50 acres and a dozen cattle. Now the Double Q runs over 20,000 acres and 3,000 head. You built all this yourself?" Grace asked, impressed. A shadow crossed his face. "My father died when I was 18. Been running it since then. Nearly lost it all after." He trailed off, then cleared his throat. "After my wife and daughter passed, took a while to find my footing again." Grace's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. "Thomas's father, Henry, was killed in a bar fight 3 months ago." Wrong place, wrong time. Quentin's hands tightened on the reins. Life has a way of dealing cruel hands sometimes. "Yes," Grace agreed, looking down at her sleeping son. "An unexpected kindness when you least expect it." They crested a small rise, and suddenly the Double Q spread before them, a sprawling ranch house of whitewashed stone with a wide veranda, surrounded by barns, corrals, and bunkhouses. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods whose leaves shimmered silver green in the breeze. "Home," Quentin said simply. As they approached, Grace saw activity everywhere: cowboys working with horses in the corrals, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney, a woman hanging laundry behind one of the smaller houses dotting the property. "How many people live here?" she asked. "About 40 hands, most with families," Quentin replied. "Another 20 or so during roundup season. The ranch houses everyone who works here. I don't believe in having men ride 2 hours to get home after a long day's work." The wagon rolled to a stop before the main house, and almost immediately a stout woman with iron gray hair emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on an apron. "About time you got back," she called. "Room's been ready since yesterday." "Mrs. Oakes," Quentin said with a touch of fondness. "This is Mrs. Grace Kennedy and her son Thomas. Mrs. Oakes runs the house and keeps us all in line," he explained to Grace. The housekeeper's stern expression softened as she approached the wagon and saw Thomas's pale face. "Poor lamb," she murmured. "Let's get him inside and comfortable." With surprising strength, she reached for Thomas, but Quentin was already lifting him carefully. "I've got him, Mrs. Oakes. Just show us the way." Grace followed them into the house, momentarily overwhelmed by its simple elegance. The floors were polished pine, the furniture sturdy but well crafted. Windows let in abundant light, and fresh flowers stood in a vase on a side table. Mrs. Oakes led them upstairs to a corner bedroom with windows on 2 walls, allowing for a cross breeze. A large bed with a colorful quilt dominated one wall, while a smaller trundle bed had been prepared nearby. "Thought the boy might want his mama close by," Mrs. Oakes explained as Quentin laid Thomas on the larger bed. "Bathroom's down the hall. Dinner's at 6, but I'll bring up trays for tonight so you can rest." "Thank you," Grace said, feeling overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. This is more than we could have hoped for. Mrs. Oakes nodded briskly. Mr. Quinn said you'll be teaching. School buildings being fixed up now used to be the old storehouse. Should be ready in a couple of weeks, by the time this little one's back on his feet. After ensuring they had everything they needed, Mrs. Oakes shooed Quentin out of the room. Woman needs privacy to settle in, she informed him. You can talk business tomorrow. Left alone with her sleeping son in the comfortable room, Grace sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to weep not from sorrow, but from sheer relief. For the first time since Henry's death, she felt safe. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to Grace's life. Thomas recovered slowly but steadily, his natural energy returning in bursts that grew longer each day. By the end of the first week, he was strong enough to sit on the veranda, watching the ranch activities with fascination. Quentin made a point of stopping by each morning and evening, often bringing small gifts: a hand-carved wooden horse for Thomas, wildflowers for the bedside table, books for them both. His visits were brief, but quickly became the highlights of Grace's day. As Thomas grew stronger, Grace began exploring her new role as teacher. The schoolhouse, as promised, was being renovated, new windows installed, desks built by the ranch carpenter, books and supplies arriving weekly from San Angelo and as far away as San Antonio. 2 weeks after their arrival, Grace met the children she would be teaching at a Sunday picnic by the creek. They ranged from shy to boisterous, some skeptical of this new city woman, others eager for the opportunity to learn. Their parents regarded her with a mixture of hope and caution, clearly taking their cue from Quentin's respectful treatment of her. "You've built something remarkable here," Grace told Quentin as they watched the children playing. Thomas had joined them, still moving carefully but glowing with the pleasure of having playmates after months of isolation. Quentin shrugged, but she could see he was pleased. "A ranch is only as good as its people. Treat them right, they stay. Their families put down roots. Everyone benefits." "Is that why you—" Grace hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question delicately. "Why I bought you and Thomas at auction," Quentin finished, his voice low. He stared out at the children, his expression distant. "Partly, but mostly because 5 years ago I couldn't save my daughter. Doc Miller was away delivering a baby when Charlotte took sick. By the time he returned, he shook his head. My wife, Elizabeth, never recovered from the loss. She passed 6 months later." Grace's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Quentin." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both noticed it. He gave her a sad smile. "When I saw you and Thomas at that auction, all I could think was that I could do something this time. I couldn't stand by and watch another child slip away for want of proper care." "You saved him," Grace said softly. "You saved us both." Quentin looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his gaze. "You would have found a way, Grace. You're stronger than you know." The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with something new and fragile. The moment broke when Thomas came running up, breathless and flushed with excitement. "Mama, Mr. Quinn, Jimmy says there's a swimming hole. Can I learn to swim when I'm all better?" Quentin laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "I taught all the ranch children to swim. It's a tradition. But only when Doc Miller says you're strong enough. Deal?" "Deal." Thomas agreed enthusiastically before racing back to his new friends. "He's happy here," Grace observed, watching her son with a full heart. "Are you?" Quentin asked quietly. Grace considered the question honestly. "I'm grateful, I'm hopeful." She met his eyes. "And yes, I think I could be very happy here." The schoolhouse opened its doors 3 weeks after Grace and Thomas arrived at the double queue. The morning of the first day, Grace stood nervously before the simple building, smoothing her skirts and checking her lesson plans one last time. "They'll love you," came Quentin's voice from behind her. He'd taken to appearing at unexpected moments, always when she seemed to need reassurance most. "What if I've forgotten how to teach?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. "It's been 6 years." "Some things you don't forget," he said confidently, "like riding a horse or—" He paused, a slight flush coloring his tan cheeks. "Or feeling something you thought was gone forever." Before Grace could respond to this cryptic statement, children began arriving, their excited voices filling the morning air. The moment had passed, but Grace carried his words with her as she welcomed her students. Teaching came back to her naturally, the joy of watching young minds engage with new ideas as rewarding as she remembered. The children, despite their different ages and backgrounds, shared a hunger for knowledge that made her job a pleasure rather than a task. Thomas, now fully recovered, joined the youngest class, thriving under the structure and stimulation. In the evenings, he regaled Quentin with details of his day whenever the rancher joined them for dinner, which became an increasingly frequent occurrence. Summer gave way to fall, the Texas heat moderating into pleasant days and cool nights. Grace found herself watching for Quentin whenever she was outside, her heart quickening at the sight of him on horseback, directing the ranch operations with quiet authority. They had settled into a comfortable friendship, but Grace increasingly felt an undercurrent of something deeper. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her breath catch a look of longing quickly masked when she met his gaze. One evening in early October, Grace sat on the veranda after Thomas had gone to bed, enjoying the cool breeze and the vast canopy of stars overhead. She heard the now familiar sound of Quentin's spurs before she saw him emerge from the darkness. "Mind some company?" he asked, hat in hand. "Please," she said, gesturing to the chair beside her. He sat, stretching his long legs before him. "School's going well." "Parents can't stop singing your praises." Grace smiled, pleased. "The children are wonderful, eager to learn, respectful." She laughed softly. "Well, most of the time," Quentin chuckled. "Jimmy Coulter giving you trouble again." "Nothing I can't handle," she assured him. "He just needs more challenging work. He's bright but bored." They fell into a comfortable silence, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the chirping of crickets. Grace was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the subtle scent of leather and soap that she'd come to associate with him. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Quentin said finally, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "It's been nearly 3 months since you came here." "Has it been that long already?" Grace marveled, though in truth she'd counted every day. "You and Thomas have settled in well," he continued. "The boy's healthy, you're doing fine work with the school." He trailed off, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Yes," Grace prompted gently. "I've spoken with Judge Parker in San Angelo," he said. "About your situation." Grace tensed. Their arrangement had been so comfortable that she'd almost forgotten the legal reality that technically Quentin had purchased her contract at auction. Though he'd never once treated her as anything but a respected employee and friend, the fact remained that her position was precarious under the law. "I see," she said carefully, her heart suddenly pounding. Was he sending them away? Had she misread everything? "He's drawn up papers," Quentin continued, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "Full legal release and title to a small parcel of land on the eastern edge of the ranch. It's yours, free and clear. No obligations." Grace stared at the envelope he held out to her, unable to comprehend his words. "You're giving me land. 20 acres with water rights to the creek," he confirmed. "There's a small house needs some work, but it's solid. It would be yours, Grace. You and Thomas would be completely independent." "But why?" she asked, not reaching for the papers. Quentin looked away, his profile outlined against the starlit sky. "Because I want you to stay at the Double Q, but I want it to be your choice. Not because you have nowhere else to go or because you feel obligated. I want." He hesitated, then turned to face her directly. "I want to court you properly, Grace Kennedy. Not as a man who owns your contract, but as a man who admires and respects you, who cares for you deeply." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Quentin, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "The land is yours regardless of what you decide about us. I know it's too soon after losing your husband, and you may never feel for me what I've come to feel for you," but Grace pressed her fingers gently against his lips, silencing him. "I care deeply for Henry," she said softly. "He was a good man and a loving father. But our marriage was one of convenience and friendship more than passion. His death grieved me, but I mourned more for Thomas's loss and our security than for romantic love." Quentin remained still, his eyes never leaving hers as she continued. "What I feel for you," Grace took a deep breath, "it's something I've never experienced before, something I didn't expect to find, especially not after being put up for auction like a piece of property." "I never saw you that way," Quentin insisted. "I know," Grace smiled. "That's part of why I've fallen in love with you." For a moment, Quentin seemed unable to process her words. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he took her hands in his. "I love you, Grace Kennedy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I've loved you since I saw you holding Thomas and quoting Shakespeare to comfort him. You have a strength and grace that humbles me." He reached up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. "May I kiss you?" Grace nodded, her heart racing as he leaned forward. His lips met hers in a kiss that started gently but quickly deepened as years of loneliness and months of growing attraction ignited between them. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "Will you accept the land?" Quentin asked. "Your independence matters to me." Grace looked at the envelope, then back at this remarkable man who had saved her and her son, who had given them a home and purpose, who now offered her the one thing no one else had a choice. "I accept," she said. "And I choose to stay, not because I need to, but because I want to. Because I love you, Quentin Quinn." The following spring brought new beginnings to the Double Q. The wildflowers carpeted the pastures in vibrant blues and reds. The cattle grew fat on the lush grass, and the small chapel on the ranch property was decorated with white ribbons and yellow roses for a wedding. Grace stood before a small mirror in one of the guest rooms of the main house, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. Gone was the hollow-cheeked widow from the auction platform. In her place stood a healthy, confident woman in a simple but elegant ivory dress, her auburn hair arranged in soft curls. A knock at the door preceded Mrs. Oakes, who entered with Thomas in tow. The 7-year-old boy was scrubbed pink, his normally unruly hair tamed for the occasion, dressed in a new suit that matched the one Quentin would be wearing. "Look at my handsome son," Grace exclaimed, kneeling to straighten his small bow tie. "Are you ready for your important job today?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "I'm going to give you away to Mr. Quinn, but he promised I still get to keep you as my mama." Grace laughed, hugging him close. "That's right. And Mr. Quinn will be your new papa. How do you feel about that?" "Happy," Thomas said decisively. "He teaches me to ride and swim and fish, and he makes you smile, Mama." "Yes, he does," Grace agreed, blinking back tears. "He makes me very happy." Mrs. Oakes cleared her throat. "Time to go, you two. Can't keep the man waiting or he'll wear a hole in the chapel floor with his pacing." The small chapel was filled to capacity with the Double QTS workers and their families, along with a few friends from San Angelo, including Doc Miller and Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile. As Grace walked down the aisle on her son's arm, she had eyes only for Quentin, who stood tall and handsome beside the preacher, his face alight with love and pride. When Thomas solemnly placed her hand in Quentin's, declaring, "I give my mama to you, sir," there wasn't a dry eye in the chapel. The vows were simple and heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin kissed her with a tenderness that promised a lifetime of love and respect. As they turned to face their friends and new family, Grace felt a completeness she had never known before. The celebration afterward was joyous, a feast prepared by Mrs. Oakes and the ranch cook, music from fiddles and guitars played by the cowhands, dancing that lasted well into the evening. Thomas fell asleep in the lap of one of the ranch wives, a smile on his face even in slumber. As night fell, Quentin led Grace away from the festivities, toward a waiting buggy decorated with ribbons and flowers. "Where are we going?" Grace asked, though she had a suspicion. "Home," Quentin said simply, helping her into the buggy. He drove them to the small house on her 20 acres, except it was no longer small. Over the winter months, he had quietly expanded it, adding rooms, a wide veranda, and a second story. Lanterns lit the path to the front door, which was painted a cheerful blue. "Quentin," Grace breathed, taking in the transformation. "It's beautiful. I thought we might use the main house for ranch business and make this our family home," he explained, lifting her from the buggy. "Somewhere that's just ours." Before she could respond, he swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold in the traditional manner. Inside, the house was furnished comfortably, with bookshelves already filled with their combined collection, a piano in one corner, and family photographs including one of Elizabeth and Charlotte, whom Grace had insisted be remembered and honored. Quentin set her down gently in the center of the parlor. "Do you like it, Mrs. Quinn?" The new name sent a thrill through Grace. "I love it," she assured him, then added with a teasing smile, "though I'll miss having Mrs. Oakes to cook for us." "I hired her niece as our housekeeper," Quentin admitted with a chuckle. "Couldn't subject you to my cooking, but she only comes during the day. Nights are just for us." He drew her close, his kiss more passionate now that they were alone. Grace responded eagerly, her body awakening to desires long dormant. "I never thought I'd find love again," Quentin murmured against her neck. "Never thought I'd want to." "Nor I," Grace confessed. "Life has strange ways of bringing people together, even through an auction block." He asked, a shadow crossing his face at the memory. Grace touched his cheek tenderly. "Even then, you saw me at my lowest moment and treated me with dignity. How could I not love you for that?" Their wedding night was a revelation for Grace. Henry had been a considerate husband, but never a passionate one. With Quentin, she discovered a depth of physical love that matched the emotional connection they shared. His touch was both reverent and ardent, his patience infinite as he guided her to heights of pleasure she had never imagined possible. Afterward, lying in his arms as moonlight filtered through the curtains of their new bedroom, Grace felt a contentment that seemed to radiate from her very soul. "Happy?" Quentin asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Completely," she assured him. "Though I miss Thomas a little," Quentin chuckled. "Mrs. Oakes promised to bring him over after breakfast tomorrow, said we needed one night to ourselves before becoming a proper family." "She's a wise woman," Grace murmured sleepily. "Grace," Quentin said, his voice suddenly serious. "I want you to know something. I'll always cherish the memory of Elizabeth and Charlotte, but you and Thomas aren't replacements. You're a new chapter, a different love, equally precious." Grace raised herself on one elbow to look into his eyes. "I know, my love, and I hope that someday Thomas might have a sister or brother to share his life with." Quentin's eyes widened with hope. "You want more children with you?" "Yes," Grace said simply. A houseful if we're blessed that way." His kiss was answer enough. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys to the Quinn family. The Double Q thrived under Quentin's leadership, weathering drought and market fluctuations with resilience. Grace's school became known throughout the county for its excellence, eventually expanding to a proper two-room schoolhouse with an additional teacher for the older students. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man with his mother's intelligence and his stepfather's quiet strength. He proved to have a natural affinity for ranching, shadowing Quentin whenever school allowed, absorbing the knowledge that would one day make him a capable rancher in his own right. 2 years after their wedding, Grace gave birth to their first child together, a son they named James Henry Quinn. Mrs. Oakes declared him the spitting image of his father and promptly appointed herself his unofficial guardian. Thomas took his role as big brother seriously, proudly showing the baby off to anyone who would look. Another 2 years brought them a daughter, Charlotte Elizabeth, named for the family members they had lost, but never forgotten. She had Grace's auburn hair and Quentin's blue eyes, and from her earliest days displayed a spirited independence that both delighted and exhausted her parents. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons, cattle roundups and brandings in spring, hot summer days spent by the swimming hole, harvest festivals in fall, cozy winters around the fireplace with books and stories. Through it all, Grace and Quentin's love deepened and matured, tested by the everyday struggles of ranch life but never diminished. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Quentin surprised Grace with a journey to San Antonio, leaving the children in Mrs. Oakes's capable hands for a week. They stayed in the finest hotel, attended the theater, and walked along the river arm in arm like newlyweds. On their last evening, as they prepared for the journey home, Grace found Quentin on the hotel balcony, gazing at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. "I was thinking about that auction in San Angelo," he admitted. "How close I came to not being there that day." Grace rested her cheek against his back. "What do you mean?" "I almost sent one of the hands to town for supplies," Quentin explained. "Wasn't planning to go myself until the last minute." "Then why did you?" Grace asked. Quentin turned in her arms to face her. "I had a dream the night before about Charlotte. She was older in the dream, maybe 10 or 11, and she led me by the hand to the town square. 'Someone needs you, Papa,' she said. 'Someone like me.'" He swallowed hard. "I woke up convinced I needed to go to town myself." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Do you think it was really her guiding you to us?" Quentin brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I don't know, but I do know that finding you and Thomas was like finding pieces of myself I thought were lost forever. You made me whole again, Grace Quinn." "As you did for us," Grace whispered. "From property at auction to this life of love and purpose, you gave us the world, Quentin." He kissed her then, under the Texas stars, a kiss that held 5 years of shared life and promised many more to come. "Let's go home," he said when they parted. "Our children are waiting." 10 years after that fateful auction, the Double Q Ranch hosted a special celebration. Former students of Grace's school, now young adults pursuing various careers, returned to honor their teacher. Thomas, now 17 and preparing to attend college in Austin the following year, gave a speech that brought tears to his mother's eyes. "My earliest memory is of being sick and afraid," he told the gathered crowd. "And then of a tall man with kind eyes who carried me to a doctor and promised my mother we would be safe. That promise was kept, and so much more was given. I learned not just reading and arithmetic in my mother's classroom, but also the power of kindness from watching her and my father build this community. The Double Q isn't just a cattle ranch, it's proof that second chances exist, that family is created through love, not just blood, and that sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best. Quentin, his arm around Grace's shoulders, squeezed her gently as Thomas concluded his speech. Their other children, 10-year-old James and 8-year-old Charlotte, sat nearby with Mrs. Oakes, who, despite threatening retirement every year, remained as devoted to the family as ever. "He's become a fine young man," Quentin said proudly. "Thanks to you," Grace replied. "You showed him what a man should be." Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the children were in bed, Grace and Quentin sat on the veranda of their home, a tradition they had maintained through the years. "I received a letter from Judge Parker today," Quentin said, reaching into his pocket. "Thought you might want to see it." Grace took the folded paper curiously. As she read, her eyes widened. "They're outlawing the practice. No more labor auctions in San Angelo County." Quentin nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. The judge cited moral considerations and the inherent dignity of all persons in his ruling, said a certain ranch owner's testimony about a widow and her sick child made a powerful impression on the county commissioners. "Your testimony?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. "Seemed like the least I could do," Quentin said with characteristic modesty. "No one should have to stand on that platform like you did. No child should be valued based on their health or ability to work." Grace leaned against his shoulder, marveling at how this quiet, determined man continued to fight injustice in his own understated way. "You know what this means, don't you?" she asked. "You were the last man in San Angelo County to buy a woman at auction." "And the luckiest," Quentin added, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Though I maintain that you and Thomas were priceless, and I got the better end of that deal by far." "I don't know about that," Grace mused. $300 bought us a lifetime of happiness, 3 beautiful children, and a legacy of education for generations of ranch children. Seems like a fair exchange." Quentin chuckled, the sound still able to warm her heart after all these years. "When you put it that way, Mrs. Quinn, I'd say we both won the auction that day." As they sat together under the vast Texas sky, the sounds of their home settling around them, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from desperation to abundance, from strangers to beloved partners. What had begun as a transaction had blossomed into the rarest and most precious of bonds. A love born of compassion, nurtured by respect, and sustained by shared purpose. In the end, it wasn't the auction or the purchase that defined them, but the choices they had made every day since to see the best in each other, to build something lasting together, and to create a family where once there had been only broken pieces. And as Quentin took her hand in his touch as tender now as it had been on their wedding night, Grace knew with absolute certainty that some things were indeed priceless, and that the greatest auction of her life had resulted in the most valuable prize of all: true love.